Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, discuss the art and science of running and the stuff that we put on our feet. I was very close to saying, welcome to the Doctors of Running virtual roundtable. Do you remember how we said that? How long did we say? We said that for probably the first 2 years of the podcast.
I think it was the first 2 years, yes.
Yeah.
And then we're like, nah, just
we got to clean it up a little bit. Yeah. I think we still have that heart of this sort of podcast where it does feel like a roundtable discussion more than an exposition on anything in general. But yeah, that almost came out of my mouth, but it's been over a year since we've used that title. So just shows where my brain is at today. But everybody, welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast. Today, we are going to have another mailbag episode. We've had so many questions from you all that we want to keep trying to walk through them. A lot of these questions that we have today are very directed to individual circumstances and situations that people have sent us. And I think because of that, we want to make sure that we say upfront that this podcast, anything that we put out, is not medical advice. These are discussions about the topics that get drawn out of these individual situations. So please do not take this as medical advice. If you're having any of these issues, and for the people who write into us, we try to, when we actually respond one-to-one, we like to recommend who might be the best person to go talk to or see. So we just want to give that caveat up front. But again, sorry, I'm Nathan Brown. I'll be hosting today, and I'm here with Dr. Matthew Klein, founder of Doctors of Running. Matt, thanks for hanging out with me tonight.
Always.
So it should be fun. We're going to go ahead.
For anybody that is watching this, thank you, Nathan, for organizing the new round of DOR gear from On, which is pretty awesome. I just wore it in a 5K yesterday and it was super comfortable. So thanks for putting that together. That's what I was wearing. I'm like, this is awesome.
Yeah, it's super nice stuff. And we got to thank On too. They provided us with the gear, and then we had somebody local here in Stevens Point who did the printing for us, Point Embroidery. So it's great that we kind of have a little bit of a community help on it. But yeah, we still haven't figured out a way to get apparel ordered in ways that it could go to the public yet. I know people have asked us about that, but the reality is we have to be able to get it, print it, store it, ship it, and we just don't have the time to do that. So maybe if one of you who's listening, maybe that's the subject of the day, if you have an idea of how we could get apparel into people's hands without a lot of work on our end. We know there are some ways that do the print on demand and they do all the stuff, but it's just not quite the material that we'd love the stuff to be. But anyway, that's a huge side tangent for the day. Again, we are doing a mailbag, so our subjective of the day actually is, if you have a question for us, a topic you want us to talk about, please send it to us at doctorsofrunning@gmail.com, or you can comment below in this video, and we'd love to get to your questions in time. We love doing these episodes. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to get to this first question from Henry, who asked us on Instagram. They're asking, "Hi, doctors, a big fan of your work. Other than the Pro Evo, it seems that the research and from what you guys wear for your races, that the Alpha Fly is the most efficient shoe for long distance racing. My main question with this is, how can Zoom AirPods be more efficient than Pebax foam? There must be so much hysteresis and loss of compression, either by compression and an expansion of the air or from the tensile loading of the plastic sheath. It's also notable that no other company is using air for cushioning. Any thoughts on this?" I think there are a ton of points within this question, but I think before we even address this question, if we even do, I think we should go back to something we've talked about in the past, but haven't for a long time. And that is, what is a super shoe and what role does something like the plate have? What do you think, Matt?
So I will address that. I also, please don't let me forget, the second part was the kind of assumption that the Alpha Fly was the most efficient. And while there are some numbers that might suggest that is certainly not going to be true for everyone, because different people are going to respond to different things. That's why not everybody wears it. I've actually never raced in the Alpha Fly. David is choosing other shoes at this point. We'll see with version 3, but please remember that just because you see some percentage, that's going to vary quite a bit. So the definition of a super shoe right now is a shoe that's utilizing a combination of several factors. A, its maximal stack height. B, it's usually using some kind of PBA or Pebax type foam. And then the last kind of general thing is other this max stack height and geometry, is there's usually some kind of stiffening agent, usually a carbon fiber plate throughout the full length of the shoe, usually, as we've seen, to actually stabilize the foam. Because there's some interesting stuff where people thought the plate was the main thing, which is why for years companies were just putting plates in EVA and calling it a super shoe. And like, that's not the right combination. The recent evidence suggests that it more facilitates forward motion and helps stiffen up and somewhat maybe stabilize is the right term, but facilitate motion forward with these super soft, unstable foams. Although there is a small piece of efficiency they do add, it's just not the biggest part. But yeah, it's the current definition is max stack height with rocker geometry, usually full length carbon fiber plate. One of the most important factors for making it efficient is the special PBA or PBAX foam, usually.
I think something with the PBA and PBAX foam, and this kind of goes into his question about the AirPods, is that it's not necessarily just that it's PBA. Like that's not necessarily it. But from our conversations with material scientists who understand this stuff way better than we do, it's more about the properties that the foam compound can give you. So thinking about compliance, resilience, and loss of energy or energy return, what sort of percentages can you get from those things? It just so happened, maybe it doesn't just so happen, but PBAX type foam is able to give you those highest properties that give you the energy back that comes from the compression. Matt, you'd mentioned that there's only some of it comes from the plate. What sort of studies do we have that show us the plate involvement? And where does that idea come from? That you're saying it's not so much the plate that adds efficiency, but what do we know from that from a study perspective?
Yeah, so there's several authors that have done this. Hoogkamer is probably the one that comes most prominently in mind for a couple things of being some of the original research on the the original Vaporfly and some of the efficiency studies going, yes, what they in that lab did, he in that lab, I follow him on Strava, by the way. He sounds like a pretty good guy. Sounds like from what we discovered, the plates really, they can add, based on some previous research, up to about 1% efficiency at most improvement. But it's really the foams that add the most, because there was a study that Hoogkamer and Laura from Puma, Healy, did, where they actually cut the plate in the Vaporfly and it didn't change the efficiency. So just cutting it once and removing some degree of stiffness didn't seem to make the biggest impact, which kind of suggests it must be something else about the foam and geometry. And some of the other studies that have looked at this, especially like Dustin Joubert, would kind of suggest that the foams play the biggest part. Obviously, in the right geometry with something so tall and stiff, but the plates, again, they really tend to play more into facilitating motion, and they also need to line up correctly. So just because you have a plate doesn't mean you're going to have an amazing, incredible shoe. It's the curve of the plate, especially in the forefoot, has been shown that it needs to line up with your first metatarsal phalangeal joint, like where it flexes or it pivots, to actually be able to have this be the most efficient for you. I don't know why. Why am I forgetting the study where they did the study author McLeod, where they found that that there was plates weren't magic. Again, it was, is it lining up with your mechanics? And that's where the variability in how people respond is. Some plates are going to work really well for people. Some levels of stiffness are going to work really well for people. Other people, it's not. Other people might need something more flexible, or it's a plate to be in a different direction, because you are going to respond uniquely to stiffening agents, and you might benefit, you might not. It's very individual. Some of it seems to be around the first metatarsal phalangeal joint. But again, the amount that you benefit from with a plate is not to the same degree as a foam. The bigger question is, when you start combining those things, what happens? And that's hasn't been studied. It's just kind of assumed.
Right. There's somewhat of a magic cocktail that has to be created for it to actually work that matches the person that's there. There's another study that looked at plate placement, whether if it was closer to the foot or closer to the ground. And the closer it was to the ground, if I'm remembering this study correct, it was less, had less of an impact. So the closer it was to the foot, it made a difference.
Right.
And then it had to do with the shaping as well. I think what else is worth talking about too is that there are, if you're paying attention, the running event just happened last week. So we're recording on a Sunday, the 3rd of December. So like last week was the running event, which is where all these running shoe companies show all the stuff that's coming out this next year. And a lot of people in our sphere too, that we know, go and then they share all these things that are coming. And so again, all of these new shoes are coming, all of these different discussions on plates and what the plate is going to do come out from a marketing perspective as well. And I think it's an interesting conversation to revisit because we're hearing a lot of new things about what these plates are doing in the shoe or why they may design a plate the way that they do. The reason why I think it's interesting and worth talking about is because as we know so far in the literature, the plate doesn't have the major role, but it does play a role. However, in talking with some of the shoe designers, how we are able to harness carbon fiber plates and what sort of designs that they can create and the variability and where it flexes and where it is stiff and all of these things, that's changing. So I think that these companies may know things that we don't know about the impact of these running shoes on their athletes. At the same time, it's going to be hard for us to know what those things are in the shoe, in that carbon plate, and maybe how they created excessive stiffness in this region of the shoe, and then they create more flexibility in another region to kind of harness as much efficiency as possible. But I think it's worth considering. What we know so far is that it's a necessary but not sufficient piece for running economy. But there are maybe ways that can be developed in the future when it comes to this stuff. The one that comes to my mind the most is New Balance, because they talk about the energy arc, and they bend the plate in a certain way that they, believe that it'll bend and then return in a way that it's not necessarily designed in other shoes. And I just don't know if that's a good idea or if that's something that they've proven. And we have tried to ask that conversation on this podcast, even in an interview with them, but I think they hold it kind of tight to the chest. So I'm just curious about,
I will
stuff
say,
like that.
if you notice, so Nathan and I are experiencing a bunch of FOMO right now where we missed out. Again, both of us are in second doctorate, so we're both working on our second doctorate degrees. Both of us have kids. I have a 13 and a half week old or 3.5 month old. But I have to give credit to New Balance because the new foams that they're using are all PBA infused foams. So I think they may have figured something out.
I'm excited.
But the other thing I do want to say is, yes, there's still a lot of plate conversations that I understand people are doing a lot. We in the research world are never going to catch up to that, because to actually create a appropriate controlled study where we can see these things, we aren't going to have the tools necessary to be able to create that level of stiffness. So it's going to be a lot of anecdotal, like what the companies might know. It's going to take us a while if we ever catch up to that. But I have to give a little shout out because I think companies are starting to talk a little bit more about foams. So obviously New Balance was certainly talking about some new foams. Puma was actually mentioning this because apparently they're using something, please correct me if I'm wrong, that not to create more like drama and like, but Todd, I think, mentioned that the new Fast R2 is using something that's non-PBA, but it apparently is supposed to have even more resiliency. So I've been waiting for this to going, at what point are they going to find the next thing after PBA and start moving ahead? So I don't know. I might be completely wrong, and somebody can comment and tell me I'm completely wrong, but I swear I heard that.
Well, and I've had conversations with him that are similar, but I think that the key there is, again, it's not necessarily what type of foam. It's, do you get the foam properties and the weight? Like, do you get both of those things together? Because you can have the best resilience. You could have Ultra Boost, right, which has really great resiliency, but it weighs a ton. So you're not going to get running economy benefits. Yeah. It's just way too heavy. So it's finding that magic space in between and getting it all to fit together.
You know what? I got to add on early. The thing I foolishly forgot is that weight still plays a massive role in economy. Totally. The resiliency of the foam has definitely made a big impact on this, but the weight is still a big factor. I think it's like 1% economy improvement per every 100 grams off a shoe. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why, like, I know people might like the Alpha Fly, but it's still a bit on the heavier end. Yes, there's a ton of bounce, but stuff like the Vaporfly, like version 3, that has an incredibly resilient foam. It's 6.5 ounces for men's size 9. Like, that's super lightweight, plus the stiffening agent, plus the geometry. It is the combination of all the factors that has to be done correctly, and not just one. Right. And so, what's interesting to me, if you have anything on this, because I think we were talking about this, I don't actually know how the AirPods influence efficiency. That's what I'm really curious about.
I would love to talk with the with the scientists within the Nike lab to talk about what sort of statistics and durability they're getting from these things, because if you're able to harness, a positive air pressure within these air pods that can be maintained, and that if these sheaths around them are robust enough that they're not stretching, I mean, I can see where that concept could hold up longer and provide a lot of resilience. Air has been used in shoes for a long time. I think about like the 80s even, with some of this stuff. So I think it's a really interesting concept that, again, that's not our area of expertise, but I would love to have an opportunity to sit down with Nike and talk with them more about that. Cause I think that's, sorry, Henry, we don't have a robust response to that question regarding the AirPods. I'd love to hear more from the Nike team on that, and maybe we'll get to learn more soon. I think we've mentioned a little bit about things lining up for somebody, and I do think a good company that gives you a comparison is Saucony, because they have their Endorphin Elite, which is a shoe that David just raced a marathon in today. That's been for his last 2 marathons. He's racing the Endorphin Elite. And then they have the Endorphin Pro 3, which have just very different designs. They have different foams. They have different geometries. You can see the aggressiveness and later stage rocker of the Endorphin Elite, whereas the Endorphin Pro 3 has a much more gradual ride to it or rocker to it. For me, I'm going to be rolling with the Endorphin Pro 3 every day if my only other option was the Endorphin Elite. I have a really hard time getting up on the toe, getting over this rocker, just the way that my mechanics work. And so just because this has a more technically efficient foam, it doesn't work as well for me in getting in my stride. And I don't know if it works better for me from a running economy perspective. I haven't I haven't done any testing with that, but from a comfort level, I would run in this, and I have chosen this over the Endorphin Elite because of the comfort level that comes with that. And maybe I'm sacrificing some running economy, but I think it's important to think about the geometry of the shoe is really important. I think there are others with that kind of later stage rocker. The Metaspeed Sky is one of them. A little bit here with the Rebellion Pro from Mizuno as well. Just a little bit more of an aggressive later stage rocker.
I think I got to add another piece there that I think people want a single thing to focus on here. Oh, what's the running economy measurement? I'm like, the problem with that is that you're only taking one of the many factors that go into this. Also, for a race, your shoe choice is one of many, many factors that go into, do you even finish the race, right? Yeah. What's the weather? What's your nutrition? How you feel? All this stuff. So, you can't, it is okay to look at one thing, go, I'm going to focus on this for the moment. But it's a far more complicated question to go, what's going to work for me? And that comes down to what's most efficient for you as an individual. There's people out there, they might be kind of more outliers, but there's people out there who go, honestly, I don't work well with super shoes. A lightweight trainer or even a daily trainer is actually going to be the most efficient thing for me, because it's also the most comfortable and the thing that people are going to be able to wear for their full race distance. It's what's going to keep you comfortable. It's what's going to help you finish. You're not going to finish well in something that is super uncomfortable over a long distance race. So comfort is something you cannot ignore. And there's some evidence from Ben O'Nig, who actually suggests that comfort also plays a part in efficiency. So, it's not just one thing. Just because something has a number, you don't know exactly where that number came from, who was tested on, what the population that it was tested on, if that population is even relevant to you. So comfort and trying to figure out, all right, what kind of components of the shoe work well for me? And then can I get my foot in it? Is it comfortable? Can I practice in it? Can I handle it for long enough? It's a more extensive question than what's the economy number, because that's going to vary.
I also think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Dustin Jobert's more recent studies that look at a lot of the shoes that are currently on the market, probably going to be off the market in the next 2 years because of all the new ones that'll come out. Actually. Right? Yeah. So, but he did 2 studies of note. I think they had about 16 runners in the first one. It was a lot of runners running around a 6-minute pace when they were doing their running economy testing. And that was the study that did show that Alphafly, Vaporfly, and Metaspeed Sky were at that higher echelon of running economy on average in comparison to some of the other ones. You had some other ones that slotted in behind there, but and that was Endorphin Speed 2 at the time when he did that study. So or Endorphin Pro 2. So they haven't even he hasn't included those in that study. So that's from Henry's question. He does talk about the Alphafly being the most efficient. that is seen in that study. And for the interesting part is Dustin posts on like Lab Rat Rundown, he posts his own case study stuff. He's a very high responder to the Alpha Fly.
Yeah.
So you're going to see that a lot in terms of it beating out other shoes because that's his best running economy response shoe right now. So I think it's worth just making sure that you understand that that's his case studies, which is separate from his study with like 16 runners running a little bit faster. And then he and Jeff Burns had the study that looked at running economy at slower paces. And they found that kind of they'd still benefited, but not quite as much. And then I think the other piece here when it comes to running slower was the stuff that Saucony did within their lab that's not published, but they looked at comparing the running economy in the Endorphin Pro 3 in comparison to the Kinvara Pro for people running at a lighter effort, so not pace. They did it based on effort, and they found the same running economy benefit between these two shoes, despite the Pro Kinvara Pro being heavier, despite it not being full width or all the way from top to bottom. Based off of P-backs, it's got a dual density thing going on, and I think it's way more complex than just saying you have the right agent of stiffening, you have the right foam. It's all of the cocktail combined with what sort of purposes you're using the shoe for.
And you, right?
And the
like,
person,
what's your pace, all this kind of stuff. So it's a lot of factors.
Totally. Do you have any other thoughts about his notion that you're not seeing other companies use air right now? I think one of my questions is I can almost guarantee that Nike has some sort of patent or something on the exact technology here. So your ability to create something that's replicable that doesn't infringe on that might be difficult. So that could be one piece as to why you're not seeing it in other companies. But I don't know if, that's speaking out of my butt. I don't actually know if that's a thing, but I'd be willing to guess. Do you have any other thoughts on why other companies might not be, or if you think that's a reason why you wouldn't think that's a beneficial part of the shoe design?
I mean, who else has used air in the past of the major players right now?
Oh,
I mean,
they're not a major player in this category. They're not creating this kind of a shoe.
Nobody else has really used that. So that makes me think that people are it already took people long enough to kind of get their own formulas of P-backs and resilient foam. I need to stop saying that. Super highly resilient foams. It took people long enough, and now most companies have some variation on that. I wonder if the effort required to go into that maybe for other companies may not be the effort's not worth it in terms of maybe they've tried something like that. They're not seeing the same benefits. Not to shout out Puma again. I think that's where what's interesting is the Fast R having a giant chunk of midsole missing, where it's not an air pod, but there's air right there, right? Things are missing. I think that's the only one I can think of that's doing something unique. Most companies have the fairly simplistic formula of foam, plate, upper, geometry stuff. So it's a good question, but I would agree with you. I would bet money it has to do with some kind of copyright that Nike's just hammered down, and nobody's felt like the need to copy that and are utilizing other methods. But I could be totally wrong and talking out my butt too. So
yeah. Also, just speaking to, I think it's interesting if we look back at the last 6 months or year of Doctors of Running and what we've used for races. David used, I don't think anybody has raced in the second Alpha Fly on our team.
No.
David ran in the original Alpha Fly, but once he wasn't in that anymore, he's been running in the Endorphin Elite. Andrew races in the Vaporfly. I raced in the Vaporfly for my most recent longer distance run, the Vaporfly 3. What did you race in? What have you been racing in?
I've raced in a combination of the Rocket X2, the Endorphin Elite, and then just actually yesterday I've done 2 races. My unofficial 2-mile race against my students, I used the Vaporfly Next Percent 3, and then just yesterday for the Chino Reindeer Romp, where I got my butt kicked, used the Nike Vaporfly 3, and I can't complain. The competitors there were great. But the Vaporfly 3 was the weapon of choice just to see what it felt like during 5K. Cool. So I haven't really used anything else. There's been some stuff I've been interested in, but haven't really tried yet. Hoping to race a little bit more this next year, getting the PhD done and can experiment with that. But those have been the big ones.
Nice.
I mean,
I guess my 5-miler I ran in the Endorphin Pro 3. So yeah, no Alpha Fly 2 racers at Doctors of Running. Bach did his skeleton scurry or whatever, or skeleton hustle race, and he did the Puma, right? He did the first version 1.
Yeah.
Of the Deviate Nitro Elite.
Such a comfortable shoe. Oh my gosh.
Such a comfortable shoe.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we should probably move forward. We spent about 20 minutes on question 1 here. I just thought it was an interesting
this podcast is going to be talking about super shoes again and the other questions.
And then other questions. So let's go to one of these other questions.
Yeah.
And this, again, is one of those that's a pretty specific situation that we are not giving medical advice for, but we want to talk about some of the concepts within it. So this is from Josh. And they say, Dear DOR, recently had a scarf akin osteotomy for a bunion on my left foot. Currently recovering and trying to decide what the best trainers would be for me to buy to start walking again and to help reoccurrence of the bunion in the future. They give a couple more details about themselves, and they're just wondering if we could suggest a suitable trainer for them based on their needs. So can we first just start? What is a bunion? What is an osteotomy? What's an akin osteotomy? What is the situation that we're dealing with here?
Yeah. So an osteotomy or like a bunion, I don't think it's an exact bunionectomy per se, but a bunion is where on your first toe on the metatarsophalangeal joint, it is usually a bony outgrowth of the joint and both sometimes the metatarsal and the phalangeal things right here. So if you can see my skeleton foot. So there's some variation on why this can happen. There's some endocrine issues that can actually influence this. It can cause swelling of the joint. There's biomechanical issues where the first toe can get pushed outward laterally, and muscles can get stiff. There's a muscle called your adductor hallucis that can get stiff. Your abductor hallucis, which is a very important arch muscle, if that's weak or maybe overly lengthened, can't keep that toe aligned. There's some suspicion that maybe, again, this is a really common thing, and we're probably going to catch fire for what I'm about ready to say, is that most people will assume that narrow toe boxes will keep your foot in that position, and while mechanically they may keep it in that while you're wearing the shoe, whether that causes lasting changes, we actually don't have longitudinal evidence on, so I have to be very cautious saying that, but that's kind of the assumption right now. And so the osteotomy is where you actually shave that kind of thing down, and the specific version, the scarf akin osteotomy, is actually where they take a wedge-shaped chunk out of the proximal phalanx, which is this toe. It's like, of your toe bones, there's 2 of them. There's a end one and a more closer one, are called proximal. They take a chunk out of the proximal one to help align things up, just because things have gotten pushed over so far. So that's a scarf akin osteotomy. Kind of a complicated procedure that really needs a specialist to do this. And then, after that, it's, just know that you also have significant bone healing too during your rehab process.
Yeah. So again, we're not going to try to speak to this person's progress or situation specifically, but I think it's that idea of, if I'm dealing with recurrent bunions, or I have a bunion, or I want to avoid getting one because I have one on one side, or whatever the situation is, I think that's kind of how we're approaching this conversation. Kind of, what is a bunion? What are they caused by? And then, do shoes play a role, and what kind of shoes could we be thinking about? So what comes to your mind, Matt, when it comes to shoe choice?
Yeah, I do think shoes do play a role, and I want to be cautious to how far I take this, because I think in the past we've been like, oh, you need like the widest toe box possible, and like, don't have anything pressure on your toes. And I think that assumes that this person has a wide foot. I think for those with a narrow foot, you can still have a toe box that is appropriate for them. I think what you need to think about, instead of just a wide toe box, but you need to have a toe box where your first toe is allowed to stay straight. That might be narrow, that might be wide. You have to look at the shape. So that medial aspect of the shoe needs to not curve in so much for that person. It needs to be far more straight. And a couple companies are starting to pay attention to that, outside of ones like Ultra and Topo, which make kind of the widest toe boxes out there. Other companies, there's a couple of them that are starting to pay attention and go, hey, maybe we should make that medial side of the toe a little bit straighter, and that might help. So you don't necessarily have to find the widest toe box shoe, but you have to find something that allows your big toe to stay straight.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of shoes that are really poorly tapered on that side, or have a very excessive taper that you could show us or discuss with? I'm looking at the shoes I have in front of me too. I do think this could be an example, but you go.
Um, I think I'm gonna pick on Mizuno for a second. Normally, they have really good toe boxes. I think there was Mizuno Wave Rebellion Pro. It fits a half size small, so
Yeah,
this curve
good
here is
example.
really accentuated and felt like my toes were really pushed inwards. So if you see this kind of like big curve inwards here, especially with the shoe that fits short, that's probably not the best option. If you get this a size and a half size up, it's a lot better. I'm trying to think what else might be a good option. Probably should have had this prep beforehand.
No, it's okay. I think a lot of companies are changing their toe box shapes. Like I know that
better than what they used to be.
Asics shoes fit so different than they did a few years ago.
Gosh,
they're much less tapered. Saucony, I think, has done a good job overall decreasing the taper in their shoes and keeping that toe box in a place where it allows you to have some splay. I think one of the things that I think about is, again, Matt, you kind of mentioned a lot of the potential causes of bunions. Yes, potential. We don't really know. When it comes to the mechanical potential causes, I think one of them to consider is if you are walking or running in a way that has you, maybe your foot points out when you walk, or when you're going through, you kind of have this kind of increased pressure on the medial side or inside of your foot. And then your weight bearing continually pushes your big toe across as you're going through terminal stance. And that could be something that is, over time, years and years of repetitive loading in that fashion with walking or running, it could lead to potential changes in toward that bunion, and where you're having that hallux move across the foot. That being said, it could be a consideration to choose a shoe that gives you a little bit of assist at terminal stance, which would again come down to a potential stiffer rockered design. Rockers are not this magic thing that fix everything, but they do happen to have some specific applications if you can find a rocker that matches your specific need. So if you notice that you're somebody that you feel a lot of pressure on the inside of your foot, maybe if you get a lot of blisters on that side of your big toe, on the inside of your big toe, that could be telling you that you're putting a lot of pressure there. And you would maybe look for something with a bit more of a stiffer rocker that would give you some of that assist through, especially if you're maybe externally rotating your tibias and you're walking on the, from outside to inside. That was the only other consideration that I had outside of a toe box, which I need to say this too. I think that, and this is not any of the running shoe companies that we work with, but there are other shoe companies that give you that picture of a foot inside of a toe box that fits really nicely because it's an anatomically shaped toe box and the toes don't touch the edge of that shape of the silhouette of the shoe. And then it puts it next to a silhouette of a more quote unquote traditionally shaped shoe. And the toes are like, yeah. And they're like overflowing over the edges of this thing. That's where it's like it's playing with your mind to show you a logical thing that isn't necessarily the case. So just take those pictures with a grain of salt. I'm not saying that you should find these super narrow shoes that always squeeze your toes together. We know that can lead to a lot of different kinds of issues.
Right. You do want to have enough room.
Just don't let that make you think that all these other shoes are bad. That's not the case, and it's an exaggeration of reality.
I think that's a good point. Some people will fit really well in those wide shoes with the wide toe boxes. Other people are going to be swimming in them and they're going to get blisters. So it's really trying to find a shoe rather than saying, "Oh, I need the widest toe box." You need a shoe that fits your foot and gives you enough room. If you have a narrow foot and you're wearing something you're swimming in, you're going to slide around. You're not going to be secure. You're going to get blisters. It's not going to be comfortable. If you're wearing a shoe that's too narrow for you, it will compress your foot. And we do actually have evidence that if you're wearing a shoe that's too narrow, it can compress stuff like some of the nerves in there. There is some risk factors for Morton's neuroma and neuromas. So yes, it's a balance of finding a shoe that fits your foot. Not necessarily that you need this perfect anatomic thing every time. And what's great is that companies are making shoes where the forefoot is doing better. It's so, we just mentioned this earlier. The forefoot of shoes is so much better than it used to be.
Yes.
Like I'm impressed. Like when I put the Vaporfly on, that this shoe has so much volume in the forefoot and so much. It's like, wow, there's actually a lot of room. Like I would have never, if you told me this years ago, I would have never assumed there'd be this much room in a racing shoe in the forefoot. And so makes sense because over a long race, you don't want your foot getting compressed because that's going to cause some issues. If your foot's going numb, there's too much pressure and that's not a good shoe for you. But, I think companies are doing a lot better So there's a lot more options out there for finding a shoe that fits you, but don't assume that you need a quote unquote super wide natural shoe. Some people do really well in them. I love walking around in those shoes. I don't necessarily always like running in them because I feel like I need more security. So that's another, just an anecdotal example of how shoes are tools. There's no perfect tool, and trying to find what works for you is kind of the key.
I think two companies that pop into my head as maybe narrow foot friendly companies, meaning they might have a little bit
like that,
little bit more narrow, maybe not most appropriate for people who need a little bit more width or are having this issue that this person brought up with the question. But those two companies for me are Puma and Hoka right now. Puma's trainers, like I have the Magnify over there, the second version. And it's just a little bit more narrow. Their racing shoe is super comfortable and it's more narrow. Even the Velocity Nitro, it's just, and the Liberate, everything, it just fits a little bit more snug, a little bit more tapered through that toe box. And it's really secure, and they don't move, but they also don't have a lot of breathing room. Right. And then Hoka just they have a pretty narrow space in there. There's a couple shoes that I feel like it's opened up a little bit, but they're overall still pretty tight. I actually buy wide versions, and I have a moderate to narrow foot, and I prefer the wide Hokas. Like I got a wide Speed Goat 5, and it's like the best fit that I've had in a Hoka yet.
I will say the Simpson 7 is probably the widest Hoka I've ever worn. For those who need it, this shoe has a very wide toe box, and I was very surprised. I was like, whoa, wait, does this have enough room? What?
Yeah.
I'm not saying all Hokas fit super narrow, but yeah, Nathan's totally right.
Yeah. The other shoe that fits narrow, Saucony isn't not super narrow for me at least, but the Kinvara is a little bit more narrow.
Definitely.
That. So I actually get wide for the Kinvara as well, which is interesting. So I think my feet are also changing with all the stuff that I've had going on this past year. Maybe that's part of it, but that's been for the last 2 years. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. We got two more we're going to try to hit before we sign off today. So the next one, this is from Rob. They're asking about shoe rotations. The question I have here relates to my shoe rotation of 5 shoes. And he says, thank you, Black Friday. And he says, I'm a Saucony fanboy, have shoes with various drops of 4 millimeters, 8 millimeters, 10 millimeters. I've heard that if someone were to ever pick up a 0 drop shoe, they should use it carefully to help the body slowly adapt to the different muscle tendon recruitment required by the 0 drop shoe. So regarding my current shoe rotation, does it matter if I run in a 4 millimeter drop shoe one day and then the 10 millimeter drop the next? Does drop variance in a shoe rotation matter? Or again, is it simply that I should just ease into the newer shoe with varied drops, starting with low mileage, and get the body used to the variance?
Definitely the second thing. Yes. Like anything that's new, like even if you're someone that's used to lower drops and you switch to a high drop shoe, same concept, because anything that's very distinctly, like significantly different than stuff you've worn before, you should ease into it. But I think if you're someone that's wearing like a 4 millimeter drop shoe and then you're considering something 0, I don't think that's as concerning. But there's also several different factors that play into this, because drop is one thing, but then you have to ask, like, what's the foam property? Because drop is a dynamic thing when you load it. A shoe with the firmer midsole is going to have a very different, what's called dynamic drop, than something with a really compliant one that collapses really well depending on where you land. So the drop measurements you get are static. It's measured without the foam being loaded. And that's a problem, because you might notice this for those who are more experienced with shoes, and we certainly do, is we try to comment on, does this actually feel like what the static measurements listed, or is it something feel like it's different? So a more compliant foam, if you heel strike in a 12 millimeter drop shoe, it might feel 5 to 6 if that shoe is compliant enough, because you compress the foam so much that at that position, you might be at that lower drop. As you transition over the forefoot, that too is going to play a role, where if the foam in the forefoot's really compliant, it's more compliant than necessarily the rear foot, that might make the shoe feel like a higher drop. So there's a couple other factors that go into this. So you need to ask, okay, these drop shoes, like, what's the foam compliance, and do they actually feel like this? So well, the question is, again, if you're going to have a shoe rotation, The first thing is, I mean, more important than us geeking out is you should have shoes you want to run in and you enjoy, right? Like that's kind of the big thing where you don't run in stuff that you hate just because you're looking for variety, because that's probably not a great idea. Find things you enjoy. And if there's a couple different things you enjoy, that's great. Because again, one of the few things we know on injury prevention, one of the rare things that if you have a variety of footwear and the study doesn't specifically say what exactly that variety has to be,
they didn't. They just said 2 different ones.
Yeah. If you have some variety, at least 2, that might benefit you. If you are used to that, right, that's something that might be helpful for you. And drop could be that if you can handle that variation. Some people can handle a variety of drops. They have the mobility in their ankle, the Achilles tendon integrity, the calf function to do that. Other people might not. So that's something you have to ask yourself and find out, can you handle that? It looks like from a little look at what you have between the shift speed from like anywhere from like 4 to 10-ish, it sounds like you're okay, but all those shoes also have different foams. So I think it's part of the puzzle. It's a nice thing to have if you can handle it. It's not a necessary component because there's other ways to create a shoe rotation.
I think also addressing part of his question is, I am used to a 4, an 8, and a 10. Yeah. Does it matter if I use my 4 on Tuesday and your 10 on Thursday? I'd say no. If your body's used to that stress, you can alternate back and forth. It's not like this acute change is going to be a problem. In fact, that would be probably a beneficial way to use a shoe rotation, is to give once your body is accustomed to whatever the load is, using the variance to your advantage would look like that. It would be using one on one day and one on the next day, so that you get a slightly different stress on the body. Right. So no, that would not be something that I would avoid. In fact, if your body is already attuned to these shoes or accustomed to them, then that would be a way that you can maximize a shoe rotation. Right. And I agree with you. I think if you think about transitioning, there's no perfect way to transition to a new type of shoe if you're trying to do it for whatever reason, whether you really like it or you philosophically want to agree with some form of shoe design. I would say that if you consider how long it takes for muscles and bones to adapt, you're looking at a good 12 weeks minimum to make that transition happen. So you're looking at months of a transitionary period if you're going to do it in a really smart way, because you build strength, to build strength in a muscle takes at least 8 to 12 weeks, and I'm just saying that change takes a long time. You got a funny look on your face. Is it because you've done something silly?
All of us as doctors are running or following that advice. Get thrown into new pairs every week. Yeah.
No, but I think we have done. I mean, I had to do that when I first started, and I was sent these 0-drop shoes. I didn't bring them through testing paces, but I used them so that eventually I could. And so I think we do now but we're now attuned to lots of different variants within shoes, so we can handle it. Plus, we're not, at the same time, we're not running in the shoes for 300 miles.
Yeah,
or 400 or 500. We're getting our
shoes
testing
don't last me that long anyway, except for like the Tempest and the Superblast. So
it's true. Are those your 2 most durable right now? Yeah. Bonus question for Matt: what are your most durable shoes so far?
By far, the most durable shoe has been the ASICS Superblast. I have 200 miles on my pair. I need to do a video review. Where is my? Oh yeah, Here's my for those who can see this. This is 200 miles from the Superblast. I still haven't worn through this is insane. This is the most durable shoe I've ever had.
For people who are we've had a lot of people joining us recently, so thank you for joining. For people who don't know this about Matt, he has worn through outsoles in less than 20 miles on shoes on many occasions. Yes, this is not like a rare occurrence.
No.
20 to 50. If a shoe lasts over 100 miles for Matt, it's amazing in terms of outsole durability. Even 50 is pretty, which is crazy to say.
I know.
But
that's
for him to have 200 miles on a shoe is a really big deal.
It's a big deal. I love how that's actually gotten somewhat infamous, where I've had other YouTubers go, oh, we love Matt, listening to Matt or following Matt's stuff because we know I scuff my heel, and if I know if the shoe can handle him, it can handle me. Or I forget who it was. Maybe this is me thinking the world revolves around me, but there's a company that was talking about their durability and saying, assuming you don't have abnormal scuffing or wear patterns, the shoe should last you. I'm like, Are you referencing me? Like, is that or maybe I'm just thinking the world repros around me. I'm like, but yeah, I've definitely just had several companies like, yes, our shoes are durable. And I'm like, I ripped through this in 20 miles. I'm like, what model do you have? Can you send us the number?
Yep. Cool. All right, so let's move on to our last question here. But that was a great question on shoe rotations, and hopefully that was helpful. So this is our final question from Paul from Amsterdam. And they're trying to work on their mechanics and equipping themselves with the complementary tools to avoid injuries. Currently running in the Kayano 30, but will also planning to switch back to the New Balance Vongo V5 as it worked better for him. With that context, they have this question. Something that seems not to work for me is anything that brings premature ground contact. I think I've narrowed it down to two main features, large heel bevels coupled with a higher drop above 10 millimeters. And their questions are, is there any correlation between a lower drop being more stable? And the second is, how does extended heel bevels that create earlier ground contact supposedly translate to more stability?
Do you want to take the first one? I'll take the second one. I feel like those are the second one is definitely talking about what's called a posterior heel flare is another way of saying an extended heel.
Yeah.
You want to take the first part?
Yeah, they kind of go together in some ways.
Yeah.
Because I think, and I almost want to start with the posterior heel flare because there's a big distinction between a flare and when that flare is beveled. And I have enough shoes here, I think, in front of me to kind of point this out. So So if we look here at the Alpha Fly, just because that's what I have in front of me, the distance between the heel and the back part of the foam is pretty far, probably a good 1.5 inches, which is a very large flare. However, what they have as well is it's beveled, meaning that the lowest point of contact with the ground is actually about a centimeter, or no, probably like 2 inches, 2 to 3 centimeters in front of where the heel is. So that lowest point here of the shoe before it bevels is actually anterior or in front of the heel contact. So just because this foam is back here, it doesn't mean it's going to hit the ground. The problem with when you have foam extending to the back side of a shoe is when you have that without an associated bevel. So Matt, I'll let you take it from there because you got another example on.
So this is that posterior heel flare. There's more than just, hey, is it just the posterior heel flare? So as Nathan said, in the Alpha Fly, where it actually is beveled enough, where the apex or where it really comes to, where it starts of the bevel, if it's far enough forward, then you may not have a problem. But a shoe like the Asics Kayano 30, there's still a lot of foam back there, and it's not a large enough bevel to offset that. So what happens with this, if you're a heel striker, is your heel, your body, your proprioception, your body's awareness of where it is in space, is your body is set up that when you land on the ground if you're a heel striker, your muscles will kick on just before you hit the ground to help prepare you to shock absorb. That is when you land, that is when you're absorbing the impact from landing. So if you have a posterior heel flare, there's evidence that you will hit the ground early, kind of before you're ready. So instead of necessarily your active shock absorbers like muscles helping you attenuate forces, you're actually going to be using more of your passive structures like ligaments, bones, things like that. That's what's going to take that shock. And so it can cause a little bit of jarring and can also cause a premature heel contact. So that's kind of the reason why that happens. Heel drop is something that can play into this, but it's usually separate because you can actually have a zero drop shoe like what I experienced with the Paradigm from Ultra. It's a zero drop shoe, but it's got kind of a large posterior flare, and it kind of makes the rear foot a little clunky and gives me an early initial contact. So I would say the drop's a little different personally. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and
you tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I don't remember if this shoe is out of embargo or not. So I'm going to just say that there is a shoe that's coming where the company decreased the drop in the shoe. It's one of their stability models, decreased the drop in the shoe in an effort to create a more stable ride. Do you know which shoe I'm referencing?
Yeah, I think where is my pair? I think the embargo is up.
Well, I hope you're right if you pull it out.
Actually, I don't know this because I saw another shoe reviewer post it, and then the thing was taken down immediately, which is kind of classic for them. So let's be careful with this.
Yeah, but I think that concept and that question is interesting, and I think there is a level where it depends on who you are and what sort of stability you inherently have. If you are in a higher drop shoe, there's a chance, depending on how you land, that the movement of your foot, if you're a rear foot striker, that can lead to a really quick movement down of your forefoot. And then you have to control forward translation of your tibia pretty quickly. I think that a great example of this is the Wave Rider. It's 12 millimeter drop. It does have a little bit more of a bulky heel that comes out a little bit posteriorly, kind of a minimal bevel. And so you can have a very fast transition from the heel forward because of that. And that can lead to some, I would say, feelings of instability. Whereas if you go a little bit more lower drop, it's possible that your transition speed but I do think that the flaring is a necessary part of that consideration, because if you have a flare plus a high drop, then you have two things that are increasing the lever arm around the ankle joint, and therefore you're going to have a potentially faster transition due to the external moments, where if you lower the drop, that brings the access closer to the ankle joint itself in all of the planes. And if you have a really nice bevel combined with that, that takes away some of that flaring impact, then you could have an easier, less externally driven transition forward. And I do think that could lead to some increased stability. So I think there's some logic there for decreasing to a certain amount. But if you go too far down, that puts a new demand of stability on your body. Once you're going to zero drop, you do have other demands on your foot that it has to handle. And if you don't have it, that's going to make it less stable. So maybe to a point where if you're moving from, let's say, 8 to 6 or 10 to 6 or something like that, there could be some improvement in stability, but maybe only to a point.
Can I expand on that a little bit? So I think that's very well said, that the extremely high drop shoes, without taking in other accounts, technically there is a possibility for them to feel less stable. If you don't, like the Wave Rider is a shoe that, by the way, always feels like it's a stable neutral shoe for me, usually, because the heel is usually so wide. They use sidewalls. They use stuff that does stabilize it fairly well. A lot of other shoes with where you have a narrow heel and a high drop, yes, if there's not something stabilizing you, yes, the external moment arms or like a lateral flare is going to pitch you more forward as you try to transition down and load your ankle joint. So to a degree, I think, yes, somewhat lower or more moderate heel drops might be more stable from what we were just talking about. If you go too low, though, and you don't have enough ankle dorsiflexion, so when the lower drop you go, the more movement and more extremes of motion is required from your ankle joint or your talocrural joint. If you don't have that motion, if you're too stiff, your joint's too stiff, your ankle, your muscles don't have enough flexibility, then you're actually going to increase your instability, because the way the foot works is everything after the ankle joint, all of the joints are basically in diagonal planes or in like side to side. Yeah. So if you don't have that movement, you're going to compensate by going excessively medially or laterally, which is going to compromise your stability no matter how wide the shoe is. So if you don't have the appropriate available range of motion in the talocrural joint as you go to lower drop, that actually might make things less stable. If you do have it, there's a potential it might, but I think it depends. There's an extreme and kind of a middle ground that's going to work for most people, rather than just assuming the lower I go, the more stable it is.
Right. Totally. I think it's a really interesting question. And
it's a great question.
I think they hit on two things that definitely can impact stability, primarily that the beveling and the flaring. And I think in a state of running shoes right now that we're in with a lot of higher stack maximal stuff, flaring is used a lot to create a wider base because of how much foam is underneath the foot. And if you don't bevel it well, that flaring is gonna make your initial contact with the ground different. And for some people, it's going to cause issues. For other people, it's going to be like, oh, I don't even notice that at all. And that's the beauty of the subjectivity of running shoes.
Right.
Everybody's going to have a different experience in the shoe.
This is why we talk about heel bevels so much. With the higher stack heights, you need to have things placed correctly to have a good normal transition. So much so, I feel like the rest of the team makes fun of me for heel bevels. Everybody know the Will Ferrell thing where like more cowbell, and then they make fun of me saying more heel bevels. So
you're literally in my head. I was about to say, if we ever get to the point where we can actually create merch for like people to buy, I want one to say like, instead of more cowbell, more heel bevel, or like a got heel bevel with a question mark or something like that. Like,
I knew that was coming because you, Bach, David, BJ, everybody's made fun of me for that. So David especially. So yeah,
yes, that'd be great.
At some point, yeah, we'll have that merch and we'll sell. It says more heel bevel or got heel bevel.
I think that'd be fun. Anyway, anything else on this question, Matt?
Not that I'm proud of myself that I didn't go on for 40 minutes on posterior heel flares, but yes.
Proud of you. Yeah. That was actually, I think, my first review that I ever wrote for Doctors of Running was the 361 Meraki 2.
Oh, yeah.
And I wrote about I wrote about posterior heel flare, and I remember drawing I took like screenshots on my iPad and drew torque things.
I remember that. Yeah.
That was my first thing I ever did. And so I'll have fun. I always have fond memories thinking about posterior flare as well.
Shout out to 361. We haven't tried any of their stuff recently, but they have finally, after how many years has it been? They are actually putting some heel bevels on their shoes. So
they look different.
Yeah, it's different. I'm proud.
They look different. I will say though, some of the more work, but some of the silhouettes that we saw in the past, like Spire 5 online, it looked more beveled than it came.
Actually was, yeah.
So I'm curious. If we end up testing them, I'd be curious to see. But it does seem like they've made some pretty overhaul like changes to geometry, which is pretty cool. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for hanging with us. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, we thank you for joining us. If you are willing to take 10 seconds to review this podcast, it really helps it continue to grow. We love doing this. It's what we do on as our side hustle here. And it's a fun one. So we're thankful for, yeah.
By the way, we record these usually every Sunday night. That's how much we love you, as we take time away from our weekend to plan these and then record them on a weekend night before a work day. So
yeah,
we love you.
And it's fun. Yeah, we love y'all. And I love you, Matt. So it's fun to just hang out together. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll talk to y'all next time.